Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Glad you didn't leave. If I may ask you just to take your seats and then we can shift our gaze to West Africa. There are a fair number of seats on the west, my left-hand side flank. So as I indicated in the earlier installment, I will have company during this West Africa segment. I'm encouraged to see quite a number of familiar faces from the first segment to the extent that there is a follow-on. The framework that I use, the methodology that we adopted carries through in the narrative I'm going to deliver with respect to West Africa. And I mentioned that just so that you would be aware. I'm going to be fairly crisp in terms of the earlier exhibits with regard to this particular presentation because you would have seen them only a few moments ago. So now on to West Africa. No doubt some nations far more familiar and seemingly more penetrable than others. From the earlier East Africa presentation, I mentioned the word heterogeneous perhaps 2 times. It's similarly the case with regard to West Africa, where we have towering nations in terms of population size, GDP size, even with respect to Nigeria, but the variance, the diversity becomes even more pronounced, for example, when you consider language. Portuguese, French, English. It contrasts even more deeply with the type of variances we would see in West Africa or even Southern Africa. Without much delay, because I also want to give more time to my guests, delivering the vital statistics and emphasizing my earlier point, for example, you have close to a dozen nations with GDP, annual economic value add, of less than $10 billion. And then, of course, Nigeria, which is off the charts, quite literally in terms of my x-axis, only running to $50 billion. So again, you have a variance in the annual value add in those markets. In terms of economic growth, fairly robust performance is anticipated over the next 2 years, and these are our projections. Admittedly, if you wanted to judge Africa or sub-Saharan Africa-wide GDP over the last 2 years, you would probably say something like, if you sweep from the western corridor to the east, the western corridor for the last 2 years or so has been smashed by commodity price weakness, with emphasis on oil in the Angolan and Nigerian economy. However, if you drift from west to east, as we highlighted in the earlier segment, East Africa has been a beacon of resilience. I highlighted in my earlier segment the undertone to the middle income study, which relates to the way we think about the step ladder of consumption. Again, I won't delve into the theory here at great length. I think I peppered sufficiently in the earlier presentation. The focus of the study, again, and this is just for the potentially 5 new faces that are visiting us for this segment and were not here earlier, a study of 11 countries that we undertook. I'm not going to say they're the key markets or the large economies. It was perhaps just because of data availability that this formed part of our portfolio of study, and perhaps in time we will continue to enlarge the market that has been on the markets that have been on our radar. Again, this is a particular exhibit that was presented first in the earlier study, the East Africa focus, and again I just do it for the benefit of those novel first-time visitors with us now. The overall study showed you that the share of low-income households continued to shrink over the last, well, in fact, more than 15 years, for about 25 years, and we anticipate even with a more subdued rate of trend growth relative to the last 20 years of very rapid growth. And many of you will know the last 20 years of growth, sub-Saharan Africa has been in the vicinity of 5.5%. The top 20 fastest growing countries on the continent, in fact, excluding the oil markets, grew over the last 20 years by 5.8%, second only after the broader Asia growth phase in terms of the league tables of growth. Again, for the sake of brevity, because I also don't want to occupy too much real estate, the two countries I'm going to talk about and give you color with regard to the progress in terms of income ladder movement is Ghana and Nigeria. Just here giving you some sense of the population and GDP size. So delving very quickly into Nigeria, you continue to see echoes of the earlier suggestion. In other words, between that 1990 and 2014, there was elements of progress in terms of the income shrinkage with regard to the low-income cohort. But what I'd like to highlight with regard to Nigeria is the sheer number of nominal households in each particular pocket, and also the clear, explicit suggestion of a high population growth which will continue to frame Nigeria over the next couple of decades. So yes, in terms of share, the low-income segment shrinks, we anticipate, over the next 15 years, the way it did over the last 25. But that notwithstanding, we anticipate a shift from 22 million households to bordering on 34 million over the next 50 years. So you have to interplay the idea that in households will see promotion up the income ladder, but at the same time, a swelling population will mean that you continue to still have a very lumpy bottom of the pyramid. Consistent with the earlier themes, I want to show you movement within the low-income segment, and you do see that low income continues to rise. I want to just highlight something to you with regard to China, and I'm not going to suggest that Africa's developmental path will parallel China. But between, say, 1990 and 2015, 1.2 billion people were lifted out of poverty. And almost 80% of that 1.2 billion people that were lifted out of poverty was in China. An astonishing level of human development improvement, and I know the cynics quickly are going to suggest at what political cost. I won't make judgment on that for the moment. If Africa's level of progress is half of what China achieved in 2 decades, and that is implicit in some of the suggestions. Well, it is explicit in the experience over the last 15 to 20 years, and it is our hope that that trend is sustained over the next 15 years, and of course, longer. I intimated that the other area we looked at was Ghana. Of course, Ghana ruptured over the last 2-3 years because of fiscal overreach, and they're now emerging from a cyclical slump, and the near to medium term is looking a lot of promise with some level of IMF crutch. But you can see, again, consistently, the theme that is enveloping much of what I've argued this afternoon is rapid levels of growth and upward income mobility. And again, with respect to Ghana, the low-income cohort too has seen migration within its various strata, from low income with a continued enlarging within the high low income area. At this stage, what I'd like to do, and perhaps for the remaining 20 minutes of this slot, is invite 2 guests who are going to join us. I've got, first I should say, Isatou Touray, Dr. Isatou Touray, who is a Minister for Trade, let me get this right, Trade, Integration, and the Labor Market, Employment in the Gambia, and also Abdourahmane Cisse, who is a Minister and also advisor to the President in Cote d'Ivoire. Please, would you be my companions on stage? Thanks, madam. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Abdourahmane. Thank you for accompanying me. It was very lonely in the East Africa section. I think a certain level of electoral occasion probably kept everybody away. I've attempted to lay the framework that when seen through a demand lens, the African consumer theme is real to the extent that our data is credible. Our study did not encapsulate your markets, the Gambia and Cote d'Ivoire. I'd love to get your insights and parallels with respect to the themes that have been suggested. But Madam, if I may start with you, Dr. Isatou Touray. It's been a very politically fluid year for your particular nation. But having said that, perhaps an inflection point has been reached. And after 2 decades, and particularly an end that was pretty crippling for the former president, how do you see and judge the Gambia's prospects?
Thank you very much. I think the Gambia's prospect is very, very, very positive, given the fact that we are emerging from a very difficult situation, 2 decades of dictatorship, where institutions were not allowed to thrive, neither were they allowed to apply policies that could encourage investment. And as a result, it resulted in people boycotting or putting Gambia aside and removing us from the community of nations. But I'm happy to report back to the whole congregation that the Gambia was able to go through this process to restore democracy, to bring the fundamental freedoms and liberties of the people in a non-violent way, which is one of the great opportunities that investments look for. Therefore, having done that in a non-violent way and regaining the dignity and integrity of the Gambia is one good example that the whole world should learn from the Gambia and know that it is a guarantee for investors to come because you are safe and you may not be faced with the difficulties that we had. The 2 decades of authoritarian regime actually affected the way Gambia is supposed to be involved in the investment arena. But also, it was a learning point for us to understand what were the reasons for the failure and how. So it was the issue of good governance, human rights, respect for the liberty and freedom of the people, and allowing an environment that is supposed to open the doors for investors to come, which were closed. So with the changes that have occurred, the Gambia, I'm proud to say that now the Gambia is open for business, is business friendly, under the leadership of His Excellency, Adama Barrow. I would like to also reiterate the fact that having gone through this process, we have lessons to learn. Institutions were there, but because they were not respected, they could not perform effectively. Now, all institutions are poised, they are open, and we are respecting everything that it takes to attract the investors. We have GIPA, that is the Gambia Investment and Export Promotion Agency, that is responsible for facilitating investment and private sector engagement. We also are parties to these international laws and protocols that facilitate trade and create investor confidence. I would also like to say that because we are emerging from a difficult situation, we are not here to reinvent the wheel, but we have examples to learn from. For example, take Dubai, for example. It started from nothing to something, and we want to emulate the Dubai experience in moving the Gambia forward. We would also like to engage constructively with other bodies. We are part of ECOWAS. Gambia is part of ECOWAS, and we want to make Gambia a hub where over 300 million people are there as a potential market by being part of it. We may be small though, but we have the potential and we have a navigable river. We also have all the policies in place because since we came back, we've been looking at what were the challenges, what were the gaps, and we are opening up the opportunities, and the door is open for the Gambia to be a hub despite its size. Because of its proximity to Europe, it takes you 5 to 6 hours to get to Europe. For the West Africa, even if you are going by road, much more when you're talking about the cyberspace, internet connectivity, we have that challenge though. There is a challenge though. For example, coming out from this, we are now working towards improving the ICT, and we are sitting on a time bomb of young people, where the young people like this forum has brought in, and it is very apt for us, are the potential that needs to be captured. They are very internet savvy, they are very inquisitive, and they are making efforts to communicate effectively. So therefore, that's a big opportunity that we could leverage for the Gambia to move on. And I want to say that the changes has actually brought in critical ways of thinking, new ways of thinking, and joining the international, the community of nations in bringing back Gambia to the community of nations so that we could engage. And I want to say that investment is open. The barriers that were there were not institutional barriers, but it was the barriers that were created by one individual who was the alpha and omega of every business entity, and therefore it was not good for business. I know some of you might have been to the internet to find out whether Gambia is good for business or not. I want to say that this has changed, and it should change once these things are revised, because we are putting in place all the measures, all the necessary steps that are necessary, and being part of some of these protocols and conventions, the Gambia is open. The size, the navigability of the river, the population, and even though it is about 2 million, being part of these protocols opened the market for 300 million potential in the ECOWAS region. And therefore, I would like to say that you can use the Gambia as a hub. We are trying to emulate our sister country, which is Dubai, and other progressive nations, to move the Gambia forward, because we are not here to reinvent the wheel. We want to learn the best practices and move the Gambia further.
Madam, if I may just tease out some of your assertions slightly more. When you spoke about the previous regime, and I think you suggested that in charge was an apex predator, I had recollections of my own country, South Africa, and we hope we will get to have the level of conversion you did. But I also got a sense of Rwanda, to the extent that over the last couple of years, you've seen a level of economic fortitude combined with political predictability that took one of the smaller nations in East Africa to become one of the most seductive nations in that region. And the reason I draw on Rwanda is because Gambia is $1 billion economy, more or less. You've got a population of about 2 million people, so you're dwarfed by Nigeria. But you've highlighted the idea of it being a gateway, whereas Kenya is a gateway, South Africa could be a gateway, and another co-gateway is even Dubai, into especially North Africa. Yes. So you've alluded to the gateway status into a very popular zone. Yes. So the question therefore, and forgive the very lengthy preamble, what sectors, industries in Gambia specific, and how does that logistics potential come to the fore for accessing the broader region, if I may ask?
Yes, the issue of logistics is really a challenge. But now, when you look at logistics in the landscape of the cyberspace, logistics is not only about the hard infrastructure. You also have the soft infrastructure. That is the ICT, the telecommunication, the mobiles, and so on. At the same time, also, of course, within the region, you need hard infrastructure where the roads are. But it all boils down on leadership. You gave Rwanda as a very good example, which we really admire. And part of Gambia's plan in the near future is to visit such places like Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, etc. Now, with terms of, it requires leadership and commitment to make those happen, because in Africa, generally, logistic hard infrastructure is a problem. Also, the ICT is a problem for the fact that we need energy. Energy is very key for that to happen, and it should be a primary focus of all African leaders, because when you talk about the factories, you talk about the industries and the economic free zones, it's all about energy. Yeah. And we cannot gain much if we do not address that energy issue, and we need to focus in that. So that is the reason why, even if you look at the economies or the countries that have made a leap, is because there is some level of stable energy, and it is one of the Gambia's priority areas that is focusing on energy. The president gave it a #1 rating in terms of issues for investment, and the doors are open for people to come in. We also have the infrastructure, and then other sectors like the tourism. We have a lot to learn. Agriculture is one of the mainstay of the country, and we need to not only talk about production of raw materials, but also adding value to the chain so that it creates employment, it brings in the resources that it wants, and also Africa will be able to compete effectively with other parts of the world. Because we are a big market. If you take Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, South Africa and all these things and so on. Now, when you come to the regional dimensions, with Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and others around, Ivory Coast and so on, we have about 300 million people to access. Indeed. And therefore, the infrastructure is key. Efforts are being also done, because I know there is this efforts, we used to have the OMVG, which was supplying energy to across the West Africa region and so on. Then you have also this zone, recently the ECOWAS has come up with the whole issue of the what do we call it, the highway, something highway, to move Africa forward. And I think we are not doing badly. It's just a question of focusing, having a sense of direction, and making sure that we get to be together in addressing some of the common difficulties that we have as a bloc, and then countries looking specifically within their context, how they address the issue of technology and other factors that will facilitate this global energy that we need as Africa to move it further.
Dr. Touray, thank you. I find comfort in your suggestion about the agricultural potential. I think this audience will be well aware 60% of the world's arable land is on the continent. And Rwanda has shown as well, just to cling to that example, how you can industrialize agriculture, how agri-processing is realizable and a potential, especially given that typically it employs more than 50% of the labor force. Minister Abdourahmane Cisse, if I could just shift to you, your immediate past has been relatively less politically troubled. How do you judge the prospects for Cote d'Ivoire?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here today. Prospects are good. I mean, people were here just before we came. You showed the graph on the growth of Cote d'Ivoire. Of course, when we come to meetings, we talk, but when we go home, we execute. And you can see that on the graph. Since 2012, under the leadership of President Ouattara, GDP has grown by around 9% per year. So in 5 years, we basically increased our economy by around 50%, 50, which is actually really big. All that is based on two things, vision and implementation. In terms of vision, things are clear. We basically have our plan for the next coming years, up to 2020. We have a $50 billion plan. And the strong focus is put on private sector, how to make sure that we have a business environment that is attractive enough to bring people in Cote d'Ivoire. We can see the result, because if you compare total investment rate in Cote d'Ivoire in 2016 versus 2011, we moved from 9% of GDP in terms of investment rate to 20%. And that rate is expected to get to 24% by 2020. Yesterday, the World Bank Doing Business report for 2018 was published. Of course, we still have a lot of improvement to do, but we gain further free place in the ranking. So we're basically moving towards transforming our economy, because we know that this is key if we want to solve the potential challenges that we have. Because there's one big challenge that everyone knows about. We see the numbers. By 2050, 1 human out of 4 will be African. And most of these people will be young people. So we need to find jobs for these people. So that's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that private sector comes into the country. But on top of that, we need to make sure that when we create growth, the growth is inclusive. Yeah. And that's the role of the government, to make sure that we actually find ways to make the growth inclusive. In Cote d'Ivoire, we allocate 1/3 of the budget to social expenditures, mainly in health and education. For example, for universal health coverage in Cote d'Ivoire. So the inclusiveness of growth is something also really important. If I may.
No, you may, please.
If I may, there's something also which is really important. It's domestic resource mobilization. Because we do have a lot of things that we want to do in the country. But if you can't mobilize resources, nothing is possible. You look at revenues over GDP for most of African countries, it's lower than 20%. When you compare it to Europe and other countries, they run like 35 to 40%. So when you look also at aids that we get from foreign countries, you can see that if we manage to increase domestic resource mobilization, if we manage to deepen our local regional markets, we won't need to go and ask for money abroad. We can finance everything that we need internally. So that's one big challenge is also for African leaders in order to move forward. Potential is there. Electricity is an area where we put together a new code, for example, a new investment code for electricity generation. We increased electricity capacity in Cote d'Ivoire by 40% over the past 5 years. So now we have around 2,000 megawatts of power. Tomorrow we're going to launch another 275 megawatts of power, hydro. By 2020, we want to double that capacity. We actually even exporting electricity to Ghana, Liberia, Mali, Burkina Faso, most countries around. In water supply, there is also a potential. In mining, we actually put also a new mining code, which is really attractive in terms of to get more people involved in mining. And there's one last thing that I want to mention, if I may.
Sure. It's
on the retail side, which is actually also linked to income, because you talk about income. We can see in Cote d'Ivoire that people are, it's really tough to define middle class. But when you look at the country, when you look at the evolution of the country over the past years, you can actually see that the life improvement has improved. And one example which actually speaks for itself, Carrefour, which is the third largest retailer in the world, opened 2 malls in the country.
right.
I know we're in a Muslim country, but Heineken is actually building a big factory also in the country. So there's demand. There's demand. So the story, the numbers speak for itself. So it's the place to be if you want to come to Francophone Africa.
So in the spirit of inclusive growth and inclusivity, let me ask and hand over to the audience. Are there any questions that you would like to address to either of my guests? There's a question over here at 11 o'clock, please. Is there anyone else who would like to? So maybe we could harvest 2 or 3 questions at a time. If I could just get a microphone over here, please. Is there another question? Just okay, there's a question over here, and then the gentleman in the second row at 1 o'clock, and then in fact in the first row in the elegant robe. So I've got 3 questions. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Jaime Tagemo, and I'm a partner at Pan-African Investment Bank in West Africa. I want to thank the 2 guests for their clear presentation. And I have a small question for the Honorable Minister. You mentioned that you want to be a hub. And when I look at Africa today, everybody wants to be a hub. We had a speech this morning from President Kagame about integration. How does that work? Everybody wants to have an airline, everybody wants to have a hub. Maybe instead of looking at their comparative advantage to actually emerge as a country itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. As the Minister for Regional Integration too, we are aware of what it means. When you talk about a hub, you have to look at what are the comparative advantages in terms of integration. And that's what Africa has to do. We have to be innovative in the way we approach issues. We are not competing negatively, but we are competing because business is all about competition. And we're looking at if I'm taking 5 hours from Banjul to US or to the UK or to other parts, you understand, carrying vegetables for that matter, or I want to go to North America and it takes me less hours, where should the market be from? You just want to find out that. You also find out that the Gambia has everything it takes for it to be a hub because of its size, its business-friendly environment and policy, and the fact that we have been able to give very good example of what real democracy is in terms of governance, despite the fact that we have been under repressive regime for 22 years, in itself is one of the criteria that everybody should look at. We are not competing negatively when we talk about we want it to be hub. Africa is vast, very, very vast, and you must think about the logistics of it also. You cannot have it all at one go, but that spirit of integration must be respected for the fact that it's a common market. Africa is a market, and how do we look at our comparative advantages in order to be able to respond to the globe, to the world out there? That is why you have the various protocols that people sign. If you are AGOA, you are signatory to AGOA, you are going to access the American market. You have the ETLS. You have that's the ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme that allows ECOWAS community to come together with their comparative advantage to see how they could do with the SADC region and so on. So we have to use creative ways in moving the integration. You have common the service, free movement of goods and services. But you already know that even with those things in place, we have challenges. Are we respecting all the protocols? Are we allowing goods and services to move from our region to the next region or to the next even country? And what are the tariff barriers that are there? So I think for the moment, it is important. We are thinking big, and that is where we should go together, and we should be a common market. But we also have to deal with some of the logistical issues, the tariffs, and all these things that go. And I think being a hub does not destroy that integration spirit in whatever it is. We have a navigable river, a very navigable river. And because we are small in size, we have GAIPA that is there to deal with investors and the private sector in a one-stop shop in itself. How we should do is to improve on those things and then develop further, because even Europe did not reach where it is without facing those challenges. You have them in blocks, but that does not spoil the integration of Europe.
Thanks, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think we'll take them one after the other consecutively. The question, sorry, just so the gentleman behind you has got the microphone. If you could just, when you're done, please pass it forward.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Fauzio. I would like to comment about the fact that more than half of the world's arable land sits in Africa, and yet we have a large low-income population, and it's of human nature that we need food. So I wanted to hear from your countries, what success stories can you share with us on agriculture, and what could be done to attract more investment into this sector? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Well, ma'am, I'll just take the second question and we can consolidate.
Thank you. I am from the Gambia, Minister of Tourism and Culture. My colleague was just speaking. I think since morning I've been listening to speakers from one to another talking about the issue of Africa. There are issues that Africa needs to address. Because unless we trade among ourselves, interstate trade, Africa have a long way to go. Today, I'll give you an example. You go to Nigeria, you have tomatoes in abundance, Irish potatoes in abundance. I cannot talk about meat. You come to the Gambia, where you have thousands of tourists. The tomato that we serve is imported. The Irish potato that we serve is imported from Ireland. When you have a next door in Nigeria, or you have a next door somewhere in Cote d'Ivoire, I think the issue is, what can we do to facilitate trade? That means infrastructure is key. Rail network, road network, proper airlink, cargo network that people can deliver. If you can have Spanish fruits and vegetables in the African market every morning, and we buy them in millions of dollars, why can't we have vegetables from Cote d'Ivoire or from Nigeria delivered in the Gambia or delivered somewhere? I think these are the issues that we need to deal with.
Indeed.
This is my position.
Okay. Can I take?
Okay. If I may, just so that I'm mindful of time, Ma'am, if I could just say, we're compelled to do wrap-up remarks, so perhaps you could answer the question with regard to agriculture
Yes.
and the tractability, and maybe just, you are the Minister of Integration, you did make remarks, the challenge quite simply is Africa is disconnected, which is why 10% inter-regional trade. Answer that, and then maybe you could complement that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that question is very key. Most of Africa is agriculturally driven, most of our economies. And I agree with you. What we need to do, like I said in my earlier speech, I talked about being a leader, the type of leadership we have and the vision we have for Africa and for our various countries. We produce raw materials and still producing them without adding value to them. So what needs to be done in terms of the land issue? There are a whole gamut of problems with the land policies that we have, and it also has its gender dimension. Most of the fruits and vegetables are produced by women, but they don't own the land. That issue is a very touchy one, and when you want to address sustainable land use, it has a differential impact on the people who actually work on it with hard labor and yet do not own the strategic resources. That needs to be addressed. And that can only be addressed when there is a commitment and conviction on equality and allowing the gender dimension to be addressed within that framework. The next thing is, with regards to land, what type of, we know that the World Bank has worked on it. Our different countries have been working on the issue of land tenure systems and so on. And how can our governments consolidate on the production base of the people by mechanizing, bringing in technology, and making sure that people earn for it to motivate them and add value to those will address the whole issue. Because land is a key factor, and agricultural produce can be very useful for Africa because it creates the critical jobs that are needed for the masses. So the value addition is key. We should transcend from the raw material production and also from the traditional production systems to mechanized farming and so on. That's why you look for investment. Then he talked about the whole issue of marketing and access within the inter-trade relationship. And that's why you talk about integration. In business, yes, it is key that we need to address those issues. And again, it is about vision and leadership. If we are divided apart by policies that should at least support Africa for other reasons, it becomes a problem. But I think we have to consider the global picture if we want to deal with issues of that, because the whole world is connected. We are together. You can have business deals. You can have arrangements. And I think the bigger, the better. And from there, we can learn. But it all asks for local initiatives, commitment and focus at the internal level while we are competing out there, because we need to go global to be able to actually exhaust the market that we need and access the resources we want, because it's beautiful to learn from each other, but we must also have focus in what we want internally, and I believe you know that's what the Gambia is trying to do. We want to get the best, and we are out to look for the best, learn from the best, and try to also fix our local context in order for us to be able to compete internationally. We have to go in tandem. They have to go in tandem. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Minister Cisse?
Yeah, just a quick one. I completely agree on the 2 points that has been made. We know these are basically challenges that we need to face. Regarding the arable land, there's one thing where African countries don't invest much, which is research and development. It's really important to invest in research and development, because if we really want to have best ways to actually use the arable land, we might also find ways to actually have a better yield, better ways to actually grow in areas where it's been challenging in the past to grow. So that's something quite important. On the other side, you were talking about success stories in agriculture. In Cote d'Ivoire, I can give you two. If you take, for example, cashew nuts, we used to be the third world producer of cashew nuts 3 years ago. Now we're the first world producer of cashew nuts in the world. Of course, that moves to the second part. What about transforming locally the cashew nuts, which is something else, which is something that we're working on at the moment in order to see how we can actually transform locally. Cocoa, for example, we're the first producer of cocoa in the world with 2 million tons of cocoa. We actually transform locally 35%. of cocoa, that we produce. We launched new initiatives, basically using fiscal policies. We decided that if you send a raw material, you're basically going to have to pay higher tax. And depending on the level of transformation, the tax decrease progressively. So we put that in place since the 1st of April 2017. And we hope that that will give incentives to people to go further down into the transformation. In terms of regional integration, we agree. I will talk about electricity. In terms of electricity, we actually deal with the neighboring countries. In terms of cocoa, recently, in October this year, the two presidents of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they met and they decided to sign an agreement in order to work together, because both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana represent between 60 and 65% of the world cocoa, but we don't control the price. So there's current initiatives to have some kind of like an OPEC of the cocoa to find ways of actually having a better control on the price. So there are regional initiatives, and we need to go further down the curve. A lot has to be done, and I think Africa is on the right path.
The bedrock of Africa's prospects seems, having gleaned from the last two installments, political stability, a macroeconomic plan, execution, power is oxygen, I think has been a recurring theme, integration. Many will be less aware that while Africa's intra-regional trade is around 10%, meaning 90% of sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa's trade is with outside of the continent, East Africa, that is probably 3 decades into stops and starts and fits of integration, actually has 45% of its trade with itself. Ladies and gentlemen, my pop-up shop is closed. 8:30 tomorrow we'll be doing a Southern Africa focus. Please join us then. Thank you.